hey, we have a must be true question. We know because, well, it says must be true. Now, as always, I'm going to recommend that you read the question stem first, have some idea of what kind of question type it is. It could save us some time. It'll give us an idea of how to solve it because a lot of questions are solved differently. And one thing about must be true questions is that they really lend themselves to diagramming. They diagram really, really well. This is a very good way of solving these. Other question types, must be false, parallel reasoning, parallel flaw. These also, lend themselves to diagramming, but certainly must be true questions. Now, before I get into this, if you're someone who can read this, a lot of information here. If you're someone who can read it and pull out a fact that has to be true, go looking for it. Go looking for it. But for the rest of us, without that, frankly, superpower, for those of us without that gift, if you're like me, you're going to have to diagram it. Certainly, you're going to have to diagram this conditional reasoning here. Okay, so let's jump right in. I'm just going to read it through quickly, get some idea of what we're talking about. Notice the conditional reasoning, etc. Before I put pen to paper here. Okay, great. No small countries and no countries in the Southern Hemisphere have permanent seats on the UN Security Council. Okay. Each of the 5 countries with a permanent seat on the Security Council is in favor of what? Of increased international peacekeeping efforts and a greater role for the UN in moderating regional disputes. Okay, great. However, some countries that are in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts are firmly against increased spending on refugees by the United Nations. Whew, okay, a lot of information here. So I'm just going to start by jotting down what I can do, and do practice this. Do practice diagramming. It will help you even if you don't often diagram on any questions. It'll make you quicker. Okay, I'm just going to start with this. Now, what can I say if I'm a small country and a southern country, or a country in the southern hemisphere? Well, I can say one thing for sure. I can say that you are not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Okay? Taking the contrapositive, what else can I say? Well, I can say that if you are a member, permanent member that is, of the UN Security Council, you are not a small country. And I can also say you are not a southern country. You are not a country in the southern hemisphere. Okay, great. These are necessary conditions for being a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Not being a small country and not being a country in the southern hemisphere. It's a sufficient condition to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council, to not be a small country, and to not be a southern country, a country in the southern hemisphere. Okay, great. Now, I'm noticing the next sentence is going to be stringing together here. So I'm just going to add on to my diagram where I can. Okay. Each of the 5 countries with permanent seat in the UN is in favor of what? Okay. So here's another fact that I know about the UN Security Council, permanent members. What is that fact? Well, I know that you're in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts. I'm just going to say international peace for space here. And what else? You are in favor of a greater role for the UN in moderating regional disputes. Excellent. Okay, great. My foundational diagram here is coming in, is taking shape. My master diagram here. Okay, great. And there's one more fact that I can diagram here. However, some countries are in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts. Okay, so some of these, sorry, I'm running out a little bit out of space here. That's okay. Okay. Some of these countries in this international peacekeeping coalition are what? They are against refugee spending. Okay. And something I just want to point out really quick is it doesn't really matter how you diagram this. If, for example, you can keep this straight in your head, that let A be a small country, and let B be a UN Security Council permanent seat. This is great. I mean, the quicker the better. If this makes sense to you, go for it. Okay. Great. So I've jotted down all the facts I can do here on my foundational diagram. What am I going to do? I'm just going to fact check every answer choice. If it has to be true, it's my answer. If it doesn't have to be true, it's not. And I'm just going to refer back to my diagram. I'm going to push each answer choice towards the diagram and see what I can say about it. Okay, let's jump in. A, some small countries do not want the UN to increase its spending on refugees. Okay, what can I say about small countries? Well, unfortunately, not much. In fact, I only know one fact that I can say for sure about small countries. What is that? Well, if I'm a small country, I am not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And that's it. I don't know if there's any connection between small countries and refugee spending. So I can cross it off. You'll see that there's no connection. We only know about small countries, that they are not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Okay, so this could be true, but it doesn't have to be true. So it's not my answer. Okay, looking at B here. And I'm just going to keep fact checking them. B, some countries in the Southern Hemisphere are not in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts. Okay. Again with the same thing A here. What can I say about Southern Hemisphere countries? Countries in the Southern Hemisphere. Well, pushing it back to my diagram, only one thing for sure. And that is, if I'm a country in the Southern Hemisphere, I am not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. That's it. I don't know if there's any connection between, international peacekeeping. So it's not my answer. I only know one fact about countries in the Southern Hemisphere, and that is that they are not permanent members of the UN Security Council. So it's not going to be that. Okay, let's look at C. Some countries that have permanent seats on the UN Security Council, okay, are against increased spending on refugees by the UN. Okay, it does look like there may be some connection here. So I'm just gonna leave it alive. I'm not gonna cross it off. I don't know if it has to be true or not. I'm not going to think too deeply about it, though. I'm going to keep looking for something that stands out to me. So I'm just going to leave it alive. Let's move on to D. Some small countries are in favor of a greater role for the UN in moderating regional disputes. Okay, same thing as A and B. What can I say about small countries? Just that if I am a small country, I am not a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We don't know there's any connection between moderating regional disputes. All we know is that they're not members of the UN Security Council. Okay, we can cross that off then. Doesn't have to be true. Okay, let's look at E. Some countries that are in favor of a greater role for the UN in moderating regional disputes, okay, are not located in the Southern Hemisphere. I like E. Why? Why do I like E? Well, I've connected it on my diagram here. Specifically, some countries are in favor of a greater role for the UN, okay? And if you are a permanent member of the UN Security Council, you are in favor of a greater role for the UN. What else can I say about you if you're a permanent member of the UN Security Council? I can say that you're not in the Southern Hemisphere, and that's this right here. So, putting this together, what countries that are in favor of a greater role for the UN and not located in the Southern Hemisphere? These countries, right? The permanent members of the UN Security Council. If you are a permanent member of the Security Council, you are not located in the Southern Hemisphere, okay, right here, and you are in favor of a greater role for the UN, right? So some countries, which countries? Well, at least these permanent members of the UN Security Council. This must be true. This must be true. And I can tell from my diagram that it must be true. Great. So, under time pressure here now, under real-time testing time conditions here, if you are sure it's E, do practice diagramming. You will get better at it, and it will help you no matter if you like the diagram or not. Do practice, but if you're confident in your diagram and E has to be true, you can move on. You don't necessarily need to know why it's not C. You don't need to know what's wrong with C. There can only be one answer that must be true, and if you're confident it's E, move on. Time is a valuable commodity on the LSAT. You don't necessarily need to rule out C and know why. In the interest of practice here, though, let's look at it. And I'm just gonna create a little space here. You don't have to do that. Okay. Let's analyze this. Some countries that have permanent seats in the UN, okay, Security Council, these here, are against increased spending on refugees. Now, it might look a little bit like it connects, but let's break this down piece by piece. What do we know about countries that are in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts? Well, we know some of them are permanent members of the UN. Great. But, do we know that the countries that are against, that are in the set of increased international peacekeepers, right? Do we know that those are the UN Security Council seats that are against refugee spending? No, we don't know that. We don't know that. I'm just going to create a little bit of space here. And, hearkening back to the core curriculum here, look at it this way. Let this circle be the international peacekeeping countries. So this circle represents all of the countries in the world that are in favor of increased international peacekeeping efforts. Okay. This circle within that wider circle, and I'm just going to abbreviate here and stick with this, UNSC. These are the permanent seats on the UN Security Council. You can see all of them are within this wider set of the international peacekeepers. Do we know how many international peacekeepers there are? No, we don't. But it's reasonable to think that there are some outside of the UN Security Council permanent seats. Completely reasonable. And if this is possible, then we're gonna have to run with this. These putting it another way, these permanent seats on the UN Security Council are not the only countries in the world in favor of international peacekeeping. We don't know that. Okay. Now, putting the answer choice here, I'm just gonna let ARS be against refugee spending for space here. Now, hopefully this becomes a little bit more apparent visually if you're a visual learner. ARS against refugee spending set is within the international peacekeepers, right? We know that some of them here are against refugee spending, but they don't necessarily interact with the permanent seats on the UN Security Council. Could they interact? Could I do this differently? Yeah, yeah, I could do something like this. It'll look a bit like a Venn diagram, where this is the set of ARS against refugee spending. It could look like this. Yeah, it could, but we don't know that. We don't know that there's any overlap here. We have no reason to think that there is. We don't know how many international peacekeeping efforts countries there are. Now, it's a pretty good idea to put things to their extreme here, to test, to see what happens. And that is, we can't say for sure that there's any overlap between the ARS group, the Against Refugee Spending group, and the permanent members of the UN Security Council. So we can't say C. Could C be true? Yeah. Could there be overlap? Sure. But must there be? No. That's a set error if you think that. We don't know how many international peacekeeping effort countries there are, and only some of them are against refugee spending. We don't know that those are the permanent seats on the UN Security Council. So ultimately, we can't say C for sure. So C cannot be our answer.